This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Abdul Rahman stood at the front of the classroom, a tall, commanding figure whose every movement seemed deliberate. His dark eyes, framed by deep-set wrinkles, often swept across the room with a mixture of sternness and quiet patience. For nearly 2 decades, Ramen had been a fixture at Al-Noor Academy, a modest school nestled in the heart of the conservative town of Dariash. His name was synonymous with discipline, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to education. Parents respected him, students feared him, and colleagues often envied his ability to maintain absolute order in a way that seemed almost effortless. But beneath the polished exterior, shadows gathered shadows no one had dared to notice. Ramen's journey to this esteemed position had not been easy. Born into a struggling family in a remote village, he had clawed his way through an unforgiving world. His faith had been his anchor, a source of strength that guided him through the trials of poverty, loss, and isolation. He had studied relentlessly, sacrificing his youth to build a future, and when he earned his teaching degree, he believed he had finally escaped the cycle of hardship. Teaching was not just a profession for Ramen, it was a calling, a sacred duty to mold young minds and prepare them for the world. Over time, his reputation grew, and with it came the weight of expectations. Yet as the years passed, cracks began to form in the facade. Ramen was not a man who shared his burdens. Instead, he carried them alone, his shoulders straight and his face unreadable. He buried his emotions deep, concealing them under a mask of unwavering faith and rigid discipline. But inside, something was shifting. The pressures of his role, the unspoken disappointments of his personal life, and the ever-growing demands of the community began to take their toll. A darkness, subtle at first, began to creep into his thoughts. The students, though often terrified of Ramen's piercing gaze and booming voice, trusted him. He was the teacher who stayed late to tutor struggling students, who remembered the birthdays of even the most overlooked children, and who held the line when others faltered. He seemed invincible, untouchable, a pillar of strength in a world that often felt unstable. But there were whispers. Some of the older students noticed that Ramen had become quieter in recent months, his temper shorter, his once crisp lectures occasionally punctuated by moments of silence where he seemed to drift away. His colleagues chalked it up to fatigue, a natural consequence of the workload and advancing age. They were wrong. The truth was that Abdul Rahman had been carrying a storm within him for years. He had been grappling with a sense of inadequacy that gnawed at him like a festering wound. Despite his outward success, he felt like a failure. The modest salary of a teacher barely covered his mounting debts, and the respect he had fought so hard to earn felt hollow in a town that demanded more than he could give. Worse still was the loneliness. At 38, Ramen was unmarried, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the gossips of Dariash. His faith demanded patience, but he felt abandoned by the very God he had devoted his life to serving. In the months leading up to the fateful day, Ramen's behavior grew more erratic. He spent long hours alone in the mosque, his whispered prayers growing more fervent, more desperate. At school, he became both stricter and more distant, his punishments harsher, his praise rare. Students began to avoid him when they could, sensing something dangerous beneath his once controlled demeanor. His lessons, once vibrant and engaging, became monotonous, filled with an undercurrent of bitterness that left even the most obedient students unsettled. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was the depth of the abyss into which Ramen had fallen. He had begun to see the world in stark, binary terms, black and white, good and evil, salvation and damnation. His faith, once a source of comfort, had turned into a weapon he wielded against himself. He saw sin everywhere, in the laughter of children, in the idle chatter of his colleagues, even in his own reflection. He started to believe that the world was broken, irredeemable, and that he had been chosen to act, to cleanse the corruption he saw festering all around him. The morning of the final day dawned like any other. Ramen performed his prayers with mechanical precision, his lips murmuring verses that no longer brought him peace. As he walked to school, his thoughts were a chaotic whirl of anger, fear, and a twisted sense of purpose. He carried with him a weight far heavier than the battered briefcase in his hand, a weight that threatened to crush him with every step. By the time he arrived at the gates of Al-Noor Academy, he was no longer the man his students and colleagues thought they knew. Something inside him had shifted irrevocably, and there was no turning back. That morning, the students greeted him as they always did, with a mix of deference and apprehension. He nodded curtly, his face a mask of indifference. The first few classes passed without incident, but those who paid attention might have noticed the tension in his movements, the way his hands trembled slightly as he wrote on the chalkboard, the faraway look in his eyes as he gazed out the window. The students whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances, but no one dared to ask what was wrong. No one dared to break the silence. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the school grew heavy, charged with an almost tangible sense of unease. It was as though the building itself had become aware of the storm brewing within its walls. And at the center of it all stood Abdul Rahman, a man who had been pushed to the brink, a man who no longer saw himself as a teacher, but as an instrument of divine justice. The respected teacher, the pillar of the community, was about to become something else entirely, something no one could have anticipated, and no one would ever forget. Al-Noor Academy stood in stark contrast to the crumbling edges of Daryash, a town that seemed forever trapped in the shadows of its past. The school was modest but proud, its walls a dull beige that blended into the dusty streets around it. A spiked iron gate enclosed the small compound, which consisted of 3 low buildings arranged in a U-shape around a concrete courtyard. A single gnarled tree stood in one corner of the yard, its twisted branches offering a small patch of shade where students gathered during breaks. The air was usually thick with the mingling sounds of chatter, the scrape of shoes on the ground, and the occasional shrill whistle of a teacher corralling latecomers back to class. On this day, however, a heavy stillness blanketed the school, as though the building itself held its breath in anticipation of the horrors to come. Inside the school, the classrooms were simple and utilitarian. Rows of wooden desks filled each room, their surfaces scarred with years of carvings, hearts, initials, and crude symbols etched by restless students. The blackboards, though meticulously cleaned by the janitorial staff every evening, bore faint ghostly streaks of past lessons, remnants of the endless cycle of teaching and learning. The air smelled faintly of chalk and aging books, a scent so familiar to the students that they hardly noticed it anymore. This was their world, their sanctuary, and their prison, a place where their futures were shaped, their hopes nurtured, and their fears sometimes realized. On the day of the tragedy, the school hummed with the ordinary chaos of a weekday morning. Younger children shuffled through the narrow hallways in neat lines, their oversized backpacks swaying as they whispered and giggled. Older students, too cool to follow the rules so rigidly, loitered in corners, their uniforms slightly rumpled, their laughter carrying a note of defiance. Teachers moved with purpose, clutching stacks of papers and textbooks, their faces lined with the fatigue of the daily grind. It was a scene of routine, of lives carried out in the rhythms of predictable monotony. The classrooms closest to the courtyard were particularly lively that morning. In one, a group of 10-year-olds rehearsed a song for an upcoming school assembly, their young voices rising in uneven harmony. Across the hall, a mathematics lesson was in full swing, the teacher's voice rising above the groans of students struggling with algebraic equations. In another room, a history teacher lectured passionately about the rise and fall of empires, her words punctuated by the occasional scratch of pens against paper. The students, distracted by the faint warmth of the sun filtering through the windows, were only half listening, their minds already wandering toward the lunch break. The staff room was quieter, a place of respite for teachers seeking a brief moment of calm. Abdul Rahman had sat there earlier that morning, his usual corner seat by the window offering him a view of the courtyard. He hadn't spoken much, only nodding when colleagues greeted him. He sipped his tea mechanically, the cup trembling slightly in his hand, but no one noticed. Everyone was too busy with their own lives to pay much attention to the subtle cues that hinted at the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. When the bell rang to signal the start of the next class, Ramen rose, leaving his cup unfinished, and walked to his classroom. His steps were steady, purposeful, yet strangely hollow, as if each one echoed with a terrible inevitability. His classroom, room 3C, was located at the farthest end of the eastern wing. The room itself was like any other in the school, rows of desks arranged in neat lines, a solitary teacher's desk at the front, and a single large window that overlooked the barren street outside. The students were already seated when Ramen entered, their chatter dying down as he closed the door behind him. He placed his briefcase on the desk and turned to face them, his expression unreadable. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating his face in sharp relief, casting deep shadows under his eyes and along the planes of his cheeks. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, silent, as though weighing each of the lives before him. The day seemed to drag on, each hour ticking by with excruciating slowness. In the other classrooms, life continued as usual, the students and teachers unaware of the storm gathering in room 3C. Ramen taught his lessons with mechanical precision, his voice calm and steady. He moved through the material with a detached efficiency, as if he were merely going through the motions. But there was an undercurrent of tension, an invisible thread winding tighter and tighter with each passing minute. The students felt it, though they could not name it. They exchanged nervous glances, their usual fidgeting subdued, as though the weight of his presence pinned them to their seats. As the midday sun climbed higher, casting harsh light over the courtyard, the school began to settle into its afternoon routine. The hum of activity dulled as the morning energy waned. Lunch was served in the small canteen, where students lined up with trays, chattering about homework, games, and weekend plans. A few older students lingered in the courtyard, leaning against the walls and sharing secrets in hushed tones. In the administrative office, the principal sorted through a stack of papers, oblivious to the quiet unraveling happening just a few doors down. The atmosphere in room 3C had shifted from tense to oppressive. Ramen's movements grew slower, more deliberate, as though he were savoring the final moments of a long played-out plan. He stared at the faces before him, taking in their youth, their potential, and perhaps their perceived failings. To him, they were no longer students, they were symbols of everything he believed had gone wrong: innocence corrupted, purity lost, a world that had strayed too far from the path of righteousness. As the clock neared the final hour of the school day, a strange stillness seemed to settle over the building. The sounds of life, the scraping of chairs, the murmurs of voices faded into the background, replaced by an almost eerie silence. And then, like the first crack of thunder in an approaching storm, it began. Abdul Rahman had always been a man of control. His life was defined by rigid structure, each action carefully measured, each day planned to the minute. But control is a fragile thing, a thin membrane stretched across the chaos of human existence. For years, Ramen had fought to maintain that balance, forcing himself to ignore the mounting pressures that clawed at the edges of his mind. The breaking point didn't come in a single, catastrophic moment. It arrived like water dripping onto stone, slow, insidious, eroding the foundation of his sanity until the cracks became too wide to repair. It began with the small humiliations, the tiny betrayals that life delivered with cruel precision, the whispered criticisms from students who thought he couldn't hear, the condescending remarks from colleagues who believed he was too rigid, too old-fashioned, the unpaid bills that piled up on his modest kitchen table, each envelope a reminder of his inadequacy. Ramen had given everything to his profession, sacrificing his youth, his dreams, even the possibility of a family, to serve his community. And yet it felt as though the world repaid his devotion with indifference, even contempt. The pressures of his job grew heavier with each passing year. The students changed, their respect for authority replaced by defiance and apathy. Ramen saw them as reflections of a decaying society, their laughter and disobedience echoing like mockery in his ears. The burden of shaping these unruly minds into productive members of society became unbearable. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was a war, and he was losing. Each failure, no matter how minor, felt like a personal defeat, a confirmation that he was no longer the man he once believed himself to be. But it wasn't just the external pressures that wore him down. Ramen's inner world was a battlefield, a place where doubt and guilt waged a relentless war against his faith and sense of purpose. He prayed more often, his whispered supplications growing increasingly desperate. He asked for strength, for clarity, for a sign that his suffering was not in vain. But the heavens remained silent, and in that silence, Ramen began to hear other voices, darker, insistent whispers that filled the void left by his crumbling faith. These voices told him what he had refused to acknowledge, that the world was broken beyond repair, and that only through fire could it be cleansed. The turning point came on a night like any other, the air thick with the suffocating stillness of his small apartment. Ramen sat alone at his desk, a single dim bulb casting flickering shadows across the room. Before him lay an open notebook, its pages filled with careful, precise handwriting. It was his lesson plan for the next day, but his pen hovered, motionless, above the page. He stared at the blank space, his mind racing with thoughts that he could no longer suppress. What was the point of teaching history to children who didn't care, to a generation that mocked tradition and values? What use were dates and events in a world where morality had decayed into a festering swamp of self-interest and hedonism? His eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where a worn leather bag lay slumped against the wall. Inside it was a small pistol, purchased years ago for protection after a string of burglaries in the neighborhood. He had never fired it, had never even loaded it, but the mere presence of the weapon seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. Ramen's gaze lingered on the bag for a long time, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. The idea had first crept into his mind months ago, a fleeting thought that he had dismissed with horror. But now it returned, stronger, more insistent, wrapping itself around his consciousness like a serpent. Over the following days, Ramen became a man possessed. He moved through the world in a fog, his actions mechanical, his thoughts consumed by the dark plan taking shape in his mind. He avoided his colleagues, shunning even the briefest of conversations, afraid that they might see the madness in his eyes. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the voices in his head grew louder, drowning out the last remnants of doubt. They told him that he had been chosen, that his suffering had a purpose, that he alone had the strength to act where others faltered. The final straw came during a routine staff meeting, an unremarkable gathering meant to discuss upcoming events and administrative matters. Ramen sat at the back of the room, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. As his colleagues spoke in cheerful tones about fundraisers and curriculum updates, he felt a surge of anger so intense it nearly choked him. How could they smile and laugh while the world burned around them? How could they care about bake sales and talent shows when their students were slipping further into moral decay with each passing day? It was in that moment, as he stared at their oblivious faces, that Ramen made his decision. The plan, once an abstract idea, solidified into a grim reality. In the days leading up to the massacre, Ramen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began arriving at the school earlier than usual, pacing the empty hallways in the dim morning light. He stopped eating lunch in the staff room, opting instead to sit alone in his classroom, his gaze fixed on the door as though expecting something or someone. His lessons became colder, more detached, his voice devoid of the passion that once defined his teaching. The students noticed, but they didn't dare to ask questions. Ramen's presence had always commanded respect, but now it inspired fear, a palpable unease that spread through the classroom like a shadow. On the night before the tragedy, Ramen sat at his desk once again, the pistol laid out before him. He methodically cleaned and loaded it, his movements calm and deliberate, as though he were preparing for a task as mundane as grading papers. His mind was quiet, the voices that had tormented him now silent, their work complete. He felt no fear, no hesitation, only a cold, detached sense of purpose. In his twisted mind, this was not an act of violence but a necessary purge, a final lesson that the world needed to learn. When the first rays of dawn broke through his window, Ramen rose, his face set in an expression of grim determination. He performed his morning prayers with mechanical precision, the familiar words hollow and devoid of meaning. He dressed carefully, choosing his best suit, the one he wore on special occasions. He placed the pistol in his briefcase alongside his lesson plans and walked out the door, his steps steady, unhurried. As he made his way to the school, the streets of Dariash were eerily quiet, the town still slumbering in the early morning haze. It was a perfect day, the kind of day that should have been filled with laughter and learning. But for Abdul Rahman, it was the day the world would finally understand the depth of his despair. The school bell echoed through the halls of Al-Noor Academy, its familiar chime marking the transition between classes. Students shuffled in their seats, packing away notebooks and reaching for their bags, their voices rising in a dull roar of chatter and laughter. The mundane rhythm of the school day carried on, oblivious to the storm that had been brewing in room 3C. Abdul Rahman stood at the front of the classroom, watching his students with an intensity that was unnerving. His hands rested on the edges of his desk, gripping it tightly as though anchoring himself to the moment. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, and yet his expression was unreadable calm, almost serene. As the students filed in for their next lesson, the mood in the room shifted. There was something about Ramen's presence, an oppressive energy that made the air feel heavy, as if it were charged with static. The students noticed, though they didn't know what to make of it. Some whispered nervously among themselves, their voices barely audible, while others stared at their teacher, searching his face for any sign of what lay beneath. Ramen moved with deliberate slowness, setting his briefcase on the desk and opening it with a steady hand. The sound of the latch clicking open seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room, cutting through the tension like a blade. Inside the briefcase, nestled among his lesson plans and papers, was the pistol. Its metallic surface gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, a cold, lifeless instrument waiting to be used. Ramen's movements were methodical as he reached for the weapon, his fingers curling around it with a familiarity that felt alien and yet inevitable. His heart beat steadily, his breath even, his mind quiet. He had made peace with what he was about to do, or at least convinced himself that peace was no longer relevant. The first gunshot shattered the silence. It was deafening, a sudden eruption of sound that left the students stunned and frozen in their seats. For a moment there was only silence, a stunned, horrific pause where reality struggled to catch up with what had just occurred. Then came the screams, high-pitched, raw, and filled with terror. The students scrambled to their feet, their desks screeching against the floor as they pushed them aside in their frantic attempts to flee. Chaos erupted as bodies collided, chairs toppled, and desperate hands reached for the locked door. Ramen moved with a precision that was almost mechanical, his expression blank, his eyes unseeing. He aimed and fired, the pistol recoiling in his hand as one by one, the students fell. The classroom became a cacophony of screams, sobs, and the sharp, repetitive crack of gunfire. Blood pooled on the floor, seeping into the cracks between the tiles, its dark crimson color stark against the pale linoleum. Papers and books lay scattered, some soaked with blood, their pages curling at the edges. Some students tried to hide, ducking under desks or pressing themselves against the walls, their bodies trembling with fear. Others begged, their voices choked with desperation, pleading for mercy that would never come. Ramen's movements were unrelenting, his resolve unshaken. He saw nothing but shadows, symbols of a world that he believed was beyond redemption. Each shot felt like an exorcism, a desperate attempt to purge the rot he thought had taken hold of the world. The sound of gunfire echoed down the hallways, reaching the ears of teachers and students in other classrooms. Panic spread like wildfire as people realized what was happening. Teachers barricaded doors, pushing desks and chairs against them in a futile attempt to protect their students. In the office, the principal frantically dialed the police, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the unthinkable. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, but for those trapped inside the school, it felt like salvation would never arrive. Ramen moved to the next row of desks, his steps slow and deliberate. The classroom was littered with bodies, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of gunpowder. He was no longer aware of the screams or the chaos around him. His mind was a void, empty of everything but the singular purpose that had driven him to this moment. He felt neither triumph nor regret, only the cold certainty that he was fulfilling what he believed to be his duty. Outside the school, the first police cars screeched to a halt. Officers poured out, their weapons drawn, their faces set with grim determination. The sound of gunfire still echoed from within, a chilling reminder of the horrors unfolding inside. A perimeter was established, and parents began to gather, their faces pale with fear as they demanded answers. The officers moved quickly but cautiously, their training guiding them through the surreal nightmare that had consumed the small town. Inside room 3C, the massacre continued. The students who had survived the initial onslaught were now silent, their bodies pressed against the walls, their faces streaked with tears. The room was a tableau of carnage, a scene so horrific that it defied comprehension. And yet Ramen remained unmoved, his focus unbroken as he fired the last few rounds. When the ammunition ran out, there was a moment of silence, a pause that hung in the air like the aftermath of a storm. Ramen lowered the pistol, his arms heavy, his breath slow and measured. He surveyed the room, his eyes sweeping over the devastation he had wrought. The screams and chaos had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint, ragged sobs of those who had survived. The police breached the school moments later, their boots thundering down the hallways as they called out warnings. When they reached room 3C, they found Ramen standing in the center of the room, the pistol hanging limply in his hand. His suit, once immaculate, was splattered with blood, his face expressionless. He did not resist as the officers surrounded him, shouting commands. He dropped the weapon and raised his hands, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were waking from a trance. The officers led him away, their faces hardened against the horror they had just witnessed. Ramen's gaze remained fixed ahead, unblinking, as though he no longer saw the world around him. Behind him, the classroom stood as a monument to his madness, a place of learning transformed into a scene of unspeakable violence. The surviving students were carried out, their faces pale, their bodies trembling, their innocence shattered in an instant. As the sun began to set over Dariash, the school remained shrouded in darkness. The echoes of the massacre would haunt the town forever, a scar that would never fully heal. For Abdul Rahman, there was no redemption, no understanding, only the cold, unrelenting weight of what he had done. The massacre at Al-Noor Academy ended, but its echoes were just beginning to spread, reverberating like a deep, haunting tremor through the town of Dariash. As the last police car pulled away from the blood-soaked schoolyard, carrying Abdul Rahman in handcuffs and the lifeless bodies of his victims in black body bags, an eerie quiet settled over the town. It was the kind of silence that followed a calamity too vast for human comprehension, where grief, shock, and rage blurred together, leaving behind a void no words could fill. By nightfall, the school, once a symbol of hope and education, had become an active crime scene. Yellow tape flapped in the cold wind, cordoning off the gates. The floodlights erected by investigators cast harsh, unnatural shadows over the courtyard, illuminating shattered windows and bullet-scarred walls. Inside the classrooms, forensic teams moved methodically, photographing every horrifying detail: overturned desks, pools of drying blood, and the scattered remains of books and belongings left behind in the frantic chaos of the attack. The sight of tiny shoes and backpacks, some splattered with blood, sent chills through even the most seasoned officers. The news spread like wildfire. By morning, reporters descended on Dariash, their vans and cameras creating a second wave of chaos in the already shattered community. They jostled for statements from anyone willing to speak, their microphones thrust into the tear-streaked faces of grieving parents and terrified children. Headlines across the nation screamed of the unimaginable atrocity: respected teacher turns killer, 35 dead in classroom massacre. The media turned Abdul Rahman into a monstrous enigma, dissecting his life and actions in an insatiable quest for answers. But the town's residents, consumed by their own grief and disbelief, had none to offer. In the days that followed, Dariash became a town defined by its loss. The funerals came first, each one more heartbreaking than the last. The mosque overflowed with mourners, their sobs punctuating the imam's prayers as rows of coffins, too small and too many, were carried out for burial. The cemetery swelled with fresh graves, hastily dug to accommodate the dead. Rows of flowers and candles appeared along the fence of Al-Noor Academy, left by neighbors and strangers alike, their flickering flames casting a faint glow against the grim facade of the school. The smell of incense mingled with the sharp scent of mourning, creating an atmosphere that felt both sacred and suffocating. The survivors were not untouched by the massacre, their bodies spared but their souls irrevocably scarred. Some lay in hospital beds, their wounds a grim testament to the nightmare they had endured. Others remained trapped in a different kind of prison, their minds replaying the carnage in an endless loop. Nightmares clawed at their sleep, and the sound of Ramen's gunshots seemed to echo in their ears long after the silence had returned. Their families hovered helplessly, unable to mend what had been broken. Therapy sessions were hastily arranged, but for many the path to healing seemed impossibly long and uncertain. The parents of the slain children were consumed by a grief so profound it defied articulation. Their homes, once filled with laughter and the mundane chaos of family life, became mausoleums to memories. Bedrooms were left untouched, the beds still unmade from that final morning, toys abandoned mid-play. Photographs of smiling faces now seemed like cruel mockeries, reminders of lives that had been stolen too soon. Anger mingled with their sorrow, directed at Abdul Rahman, at the school, at the police who hadn't arrived in time, and even at God. The questions haunted them: why? Why our children? How could this have happened? Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the events leading up to the massacre, combing through Ramen's life for any clue that might explain his actions. They searched his small apartment, a cramped and sparsely furnished space that betrayed little of the horror he would unleash. Among the stacks of neatly organized lesson plans and prayer books, they found disturbing fragments, notes scribbled in the margins of journals, passages from scripture twisted into something unrecognizable. It became clear that Ramen had meticulously planned the attack, his descent into madness masked by his quiet, disciplined demeanor. But what truly broke him? The investigators could only speculate, piecing together a narrative of mounting pressure, isolation, and a festering darkness that had finally consumed him. The town's collective rage began to boil over. Protests erupted outside the police station, where Ramen was being held in solitary confinement. Crowds gathered, demanding answers, demanding justice. Some held signs condemning him as a monster, while others carried banners calling for reforms in mental health and gun control. The debates raged in public squares, in homes, and in parliament chambers, where politicians seized upon the tragedy to push their agendas. Was this the result of a broken man slipping through the cracks of a failing system? Or was it the act of pure, incomprehensible evil? The school itself became a focal point of the community's anguish. Some called for it to be demolished, believing that no child should ever walk its halls again. Others argued that it should remain, transformed into a memorial for the victims, a permanent reminder of what had been lost. For now it stood empty, its walls bearing the scars of the massacre, the bloodstains faded but not forgotten. Parents walked their children past it with hurried steps, their eyes averted, as though to look too long was to invite the darkness into their own lives. Abdul Rahman, now the most reviled man in Dariash, sat alone in his cell, awaiting trial. He spoke little, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. His face haggard and pale, bore no trace of remorse or defiance, only a hollow detachment. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate him, but Ramen offered little insight into his mind. He refused to explain his actions, meeting their questions with silence or cryptic, fragmented statements that only deepened the mystery. Was he a madman? A zealot? A victim of his own suppressed demons? The nation wanted answers, but Ramen remained a cipher, his motives locked away in the depths of his fractured psyche. As weeks turned to months, the town of Dariash began to show the faintest signs of recovery. The surviving students returned to school, though not to Al-Noor Academy. The government provided funding for a new institution, built miles away from the site of the massacre, its halls filled with extra security measures and counselors on staff. But the wounds left by that day would not heal easily. For some, they would never heal at all. The massacre left a permanent mark on the collective consciousness of the town, the nation, and beyond. Its story became the subject of documentaries, books, and endless debates. But for those who had lived through it, it was not a story, it was a scar, raw and unrelenting, a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk behind even the most trusted faces. And as the world moved on, Dariash remained, caught between memory and survival, its people forever haunted by the question that would never truly be answered: how could this happen? The investigation into the massacre at Al-Noor Academy was unlike anything the small town of Dariash or the nation had ever seen. Within hours of Abdul Rahman's arrest, a multi-agency task force descended on the scene, determined to uncover every detail behind one of the most horrifying school shootings in the country's history. The initial shock of the crime was quickly replaced by an insatiable demand for answers. How could a man so trusted, so respected, commit an atrocity of this magnitude? What signs had been missed? And perhaps most disturbingly, could it have been prevented? The investigators began by combing through Ramen's personal life, dismantling the image of the dedicated teacher and devout man that had defined him for decades. They searched his apartment, a cramped, sparsely decorated space that offered little in the way of comfort or personal connection. There were no family photos, no sentimental keepsakes, only shelves lined with religious texts, history books, and meticulous notebooks filled with his handwriting. At first glance, the notebooks seemed like lesson plans, their pages neat and organized. But interspersed among the educational material were disturbing fragments, rambling passages about purity and decay, lists of grievances against the school and society, and cryptic phrases that hinted at his growing obsession with violence. One notebook, in particular, caught the attention of investigators. It appeared to be a manifesto, though incomplete, its pages filled with furious scribbles and disjointed thoughts. Ramen wrote about his belief that the world was drowning in corruption, that modern society had turned away from morality and faith. He saw himself as a shepherd tasked with guiding the lost back to righteousness, but somewhere along the way, that vision had twisted into something monstrous. He no longer saw teaching as his path to salvation, but as a futile effort in a world that refused to change. The words on the page painted a chilling portrait of a man consumed by despair and rage, his mind unraveling under the weight of his own convictions. Forensic experts examined the physical evidence from the classroom, cataloging every bullet hole, every bloodstain, every shattered desk. The pistol Ramen had used, a legally obtained firearm purchased years earlier, was traced back to a local shop. The owner remembered Ramen as quiet and polite, a man who had seemed almost apologetic when making the purchase. At the time, it had raised no alarms after all. Many people in Dariash owned guns for self-defense. But now, in the aftermath of the massacre, even the most mundane details of Ramen's life took on a sinister significance. Interviews with colleagues and students painted a picture of a man who had been slowly unraveling over the course of years. Teachers spoke of his increasing isolation, his growing frustration with his students, and his escalating rigidity in the classroom. Some had noticed his temper fraying, the way he seemed to hover on the edge of an outburst, though he always managed to pull himself back. Students recalled his piercing gaze, the way his presence seemed to fill the room with an unspoken tension. In hindsight, the warning signs were there, but like pieces of a shattered mirror, they had only become clear when assembled after the fact. The deeper investigators delved, the more they uncovered about the pressures that had weighed on Ramen. Financial records revealed mounting debts, unpaid bills that he had tried to hide from his colleagues and neighbors. His bank account was nearly empty, his meager teacher's salary stretched too thin to cover even basic expenses. Witnesses spoke of his strained relationship with the community, the subtle but persistent judgment he faced as an unmarried man in a conservative town. Ramen's once immaculate reputation had begun to fray at the edges long before the massacre, But pride and shame had kept him from seeking help. Instead, he retreated further into himself, his isolation feeding the darkness that would ultimately consume him. In the weeks following the massacre, psychologists and criminal profilers attempted to make sense of Ramen's actions. They debated whether he was driven by mental illness, ideological extremism, or a toxic combination of both. Some argued that he exhibited signs of severe depression and paranoia, his behavior indicative of a man trapped in a downward spiral of self-loathing and hopelessness. Others pointed to his writings as evidence of a warped moral framework, a mind consumed by delusions of righteousness. Whatever the cause, one fact was clear: Ramen had crossed a line that could never be undone, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. The trial was a spectacle, broadcast across the nation as the public clamored for justice. Ramen's stoic demeanor in court only deepened the mystery surrounding him. He offered no apology, no explanation for his actions, remaining silent as the prosecution laid out the gruesome details of his crime. Witnesses testified about the horror they had endured, their voices trembling as they recounted the gunshots, the screams, the blood. The families of the victims sat in the courtroom, their grief palpable, their eyes fixed on the man who had stolen their children from them. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty. Ramen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his name forever etched into the annals of infamy. But for many, the verdict brought little solace. Justice had been served, but the wounds left by the massacre would never fully heal. The lives lost could never be replaced, the innocence shattered could never be restored. The legacy of the massacre extended far beyond the courtroom. Al-Noor Academy remained closed, its blood-stained walls standing as a grim reminder of what had happened. Some called for the school to be demolished, while others argued that it should be preserved as a memorial to the victims. Ultimately, the decision was made to tear it down, the land left vacant as the community struggled to move forward. But the memories could not be erased so easily. For the people of Dariash, the massacre became a permanent scar, a moment that divided their lives into before and after. Nationally, the tragedy reignited debates about mental health, gun control, and school safety. Politicians seized upon the event to push their agendas, their speeches filled with promises of reform. But in the end, little changed. The outrage faded, replaced by the next headline, the next crisis. For those who had lived through the massacre, however, the pain remained as sharp as ever, a constant reminder of how fragile safety and normalcy truly were. Abdul Rahman's story became a case study for criminologists and psychologists, his actions dissected in countless books, documentaries, and academic papers. He became a symbol of the dangers lurking beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives, a warning that even the most trusted individuals could harbor unimaginable darkness. But for the families of his victims, Ramen was not a case study or a symbol. He was a monster, a man who had stolen their futures and left them with nothing but grief. In the years that followed, the children of Dariash grew up in the shadow of the massacre, their lives shaped by a tragedy they could not fully understand. They carried the weight of what had happened, their innocence replaced by a wary awareness of the darkness that could hide in plain sight. And though the world moved on, the memory of that day remained, a chilling reminder of the fragility of humanity and the depths to which it could fall.